All right, so a couple disclaimers before we get into things. I'm going to be raising a lot of questions that don't necessarily have easy answers, and I'm not raising them to answer them. I'm raising them because I think they're discussions that are happening on the margins, and I'd like to shove those into the spotlight. Additionally, there's going to be some disturbing imagery and language in this presentation, so just a heads up. And I'm going to be making a number of assertions. I have evidence and rational arguments for all of that, but we only have about 20 minutes, so I'll do my best. But feel free to ask me as many questions at the end.
What is disturbing, and what do you mean by disturbing imagery?
There's going to be some imagery of police brutality, as what some people might term. Sorry. I'll do my best to give a heads up right when we get to that slide. There's a quote from Rick right before we get to it, just so you know. I'm David Nichols. Sorry. I know. So basically, just to kick things off, a few assertions. First is humanity currently faces dire existential threats, most notably in the form of nuclear proliferation and climate change. These are being rapidly accelerated under the Republican Party, but proliferation was definitely going on under Obama. Number two, slavery and genocide were foundational to the US and American capitalism, and those legacies are alive and well. The US is a waning hegemonic power, and it's still clinging to the grand area that was carved out after World War II. If you're wondering why this is relevant, it has to do directly with where we're deploying troops, and if we're going to be talking about treating veterans for PTSD, I think we have to understand the systems of why they are where they are in the world. Additionally, industrial civilization is unsustainable and the main cause of ecocide, which is to say that the Earth is not dying, it's being killed, and those who are killing it have names and addresses. The same goes for social safety nets. And ultimately, psychedelics only matter in a human context, which is to say, when we talk about the benefits of psychedelics, we're talking about the benefits to us, to our friends, to our family, to society at large. If society isn't around, there's no benefits. So let's take a brief look at why drugs are illegal. We can trace this back to white supremacy and the notions that, cocaine-crazed Negroes required higher caliber bullets and multiple rounds to stop them from raping white women. We can talk about imperialism and the statements by folks like John Ehrlichman, who publicly acknowledged that it was not possible to criminalize being against the war or being black, but they very well could criminalize the compounds that these groups were using and use those as a pretext to go after the groups themselves. Additionally, if we look at this quote by Nixon, homosexuality, dope, immorality in general are the enemies of strong societies, we can see what's being presented as vice. So the notion that homosexuality is vice ties misogyny with drugs and criminalization. And I'm hardly the first pundit to comment that psychedelics aren't good for the production of widgets. And we can talk more about microdosing later, but I would suggest that that's playing a role in what we're seeing as far as this mainstreaming. Now, to take a moment and look at dominant culture and the state, and when I say dominant culture, I mean systems of white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, the industrial civilization, things that we find ourselves ground under the heel of on a daily basis. They're predicated on coercion and violence, which is to say social peace is an illusion. Every law in this society is enforced down the barrel of a gun. If you break the law, the expectation is that the cops will show up armed, granted the ability to use lethal force. If you're black or brown, you probably know that significantly better than many other people in society. And there's also the ability for them to lock you in a cage. Now, I would contend that authority is not self-justifying. That means if somebody's going to tell you you can't do something, or if something is a certain way, they better be able to back that up with actual evidence and reasons. As such, it bears noting that psychedelics weren't criminalized by accident, but for political reasons, and that there was no evidence with which to make claims about their dangers to individuals or society. And as such, psychedelics belong in the public domain. Medical, spiritual, intellectual, and recreational applications are all equally legitimate. This brings us to some issues with the medical model. First, the legitimacy of the medical model is predicated on prohibitionist dynamics. That is to say, there was no rationale for criminalizing these things in the first place, so when the medical community says, hey, we recognize that these are very dangerous, but trust us, we're professionals, we have the ability to work with these things safely, they've already accepted that the state's argument is valid when we all know that it's not. Second, when we look at, it blows me away that there are so many incredibly talented and well-trained professionals who talk about psychedelics being profound medicines because they approach cures, right? We're looking at single or very few interventions to see tremendous results. But then when we see how these are being applied on a systemic level, we're treating individuals and then putting them back into these profoundly sick systems. And so what we see is, on the macro level, systemic symptom management rather than striving for any sort of cultural cure. And I've seen a number of professionals outright dismiss that that's even a possibility. Additionally, there's been a lot of claims about, professional medicine being capable of taking on the burdens and the risk. But if we look historically, and even if we just limit it to a US context, we can see that medicine is and was racist and classist. We can look at folks like Henrietta Lacks, who had their biological property stolen. We can look at the experiments that were done on the Tuskegee airmen. This isn't like a radical notion that there are problems with medicine. And additionally, Nick Sand stated, psychedelics are not solely about curing ill people, but about making well people weller. And my concern is that the medical model will ultimately subvert and push all these other options to the side in its focus to race towards legalization or medicalization, as is perhaps more accurate. So there's been a lot of talk about mainstreaming, and it seems important to sort of break down what mainstreaming is. Now, personally, I would contend that mainstreaming is a project of respectability politics, wherein we're expected to show that our values are continuous with those of dominant culture. So that would mean that we're showing that our values are continuous with things like white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, and I would contend that that ultimately results in the whitewashing or homogenization of marginalized perspectives, right? Those of us who are ethnic minorities, those of us who are racial minorities, those of us who are maybe gender nonconformist or radicals, find ourselves in a position where our values are fundamentally at odds with those of dominant culture. So we can already anticipate that there's no space for us in mainstreaming, because there's no space for us in the mainstream in the first place. Additionally, as Jeff pointed out wonderfully, the way that things exist in the mainstream is as commodities. They're commercialized, they're bought and sold. Any value that they have intrinsically to themselves and to us is removed and instead placed in the context of the market to be bought and sold and stripped of that potential additional value. And we also see the flattening and commodification of culture. This is true not only when people make statements about what the indigenous would do or say as, monolithic groups, but as somebody who's spent quite a bit of time working on underground psychedelic research, publishing phytochemical breakdowns of all sorts, I've always bristled when a certain organization sends out funding requests under the notion of support psychedelic science. Because to me, it seems like there's so many more interesting ways that we can support psychedelic science than just giving money. I think we all have things that we can contribute to these fields, and I think emphasizing that diversity rather than flattening it is really important. So obviously it's apparent that I think the mainstream is a mistake. And the main reason is that, as I've said, dominant culture is literally presenting an existential threat to human life on this planet. And if we don't exist, psychedelics really don't matter. And for people who are pushing mainstreaming, I would suggest that, as with any assertion you make, that the burden of evidence is on you. So where's the historical or peer-reviewed evidence that mainstreaming has ever worked? And if we don't have evidence, then I think we can say that it's meaningless propaganda, which takes us to this notion of support the troops. The point of public relations slogans like support our troops is that they don't mean anything. That's the whole point of good propaganda. You want to create a slogan that nobody's going to be against and everybody's going to be for. Nobody knows what it means because it doesn't mean anything. Its crucial value is that it diverts your attention from a question that does mean something. Do you support our policy? That's the one you're not allowed to talk about. So similarly to Rick, I don't have a problem naming names. There's a company named Compass that has stepped into this arena. They're a venture capitalist-backed endeavor that's looking to engage in a vertically integrated model of psilocybin therapy for depression. So if we take a moment and look at how for-profit works, it seems worth noting they put money over everything. They're essentially venture capitalists who invest in this company, and they have a requirement for a return on their investment. That's why they're giving you money in the first place. They're expecting money back. So if they're expecting money back, that means they need an exit strategy, right? They need to get their money out of that investment. Exit strategies generally look like initial public offerings, or in this case, a big pharma buyout. Now, a big pharma buyout means any of the intellectual property, including exclusivity agreements and junk patents that people may say don't have much value other than to restrict access for others, become the property of that big pharma company. Now, I think everybody in this room knows how big pharma companies wield those powers, and the notion that that wouldn't create restrictions for other people, to me, seems a little absurd. Additionally, if we take a moment and look at this model of vertical integration, right, basically this means that they're looking to control the supply chain from synthesis through therapy. And that ultimately gives them a lockdown where they can deny access to other folks really by any means possible. If they control all aspects of that supply chain, there's very little room for other people to get involved. That also means that they can utilize value-based pricing to maximize profits. And what value-based pricing would look like is, let's say, cost to an insurer for traditional therapy for depression costs $10,000 a year. Now, let's say you can afford to sell psilocybin therapy for $2,000 a year, but you recognize that you could offer it to the insurance company for $8,000 a year, because they're still going to save $2,000 at the end, and you're going to put a lot more money in your pocket. But the thing is, we're the people that pay insurance premiums, and it seems pretty simple to suggest that a premium for a $2,000 per year therapy is going to be a hell of a lot lower than $8,000 per year. So when we look at what the results of vertical integration are, we see that it's the monopolization of markets, it's the manipulation of prices, it's the privatization of benefits, and it's the socialization of cost. And as Jeff pointed out, that's not unique. That's how capitalism works. Additionally, if we look at some of the characters involved in Compass, we can see that there's an empowerment of authoritarians and surveillance apparatus. And so let's look at Peter Thiel, right? Not only did he provide the funds for Hulk Hogan to shut down Gawker, but he created Palantir. If you're not familiar with Palantir, it is perhaps the most insidious surveillance apparatus that exists to date, which I would suggest is significant if there's a lot of people in this room who may be part of criminal subcultures. Now, Palantir was funded by the CIA venture capitalist fund in QTEL. I actually didn't know they had a venture capitalist fund until I started digging around in this. And that Palantir is actually used by ICE for mass deportations and rounding up of immigrants, as well as other law enforcement officers to come after people who may be in criminalized subcultures. So the notion that organizations that are maybe advocating for criminalized subcultures climbing into bed with Peter Thiel doesn't make much sense to me. Now, additionally, in a speech given to the Cato Institute in 2009, Thiel stated, "The vast increase in welfare beneficiaries and the extension of the franchise to women have rendered the notion of capitalist democracy into an oxymoron." Additionally, in that same talk, he stated, "The 1920s were the last decade in American history during which one could be genuinely optimistic about politics." Now, if you know anything about the 1920s, it's the last time social and wealth inequity in this country remotely approached the absurd state that we're in today. So I think this gives a pretty clear vision of what Thiel imagines. Now, if we understand the economic drivers of military enlistment, right? If we understand that with a high school diploma or GED, you can earn significantly more money in the military, that you've got things like the PX and commissary that offer cheaper goods without being taxed. I mean, I had an ex-partner I was with for a long time who was in a military family, and the amount of financial benefits you get are incredible. We're seeing the social safety nets shredded before our eyes. TRICARE provides such incredible insurance compared to what's available through Obamacare or the private market. It's pretty simple to argue that Peter Thiel's societal vision is fundamentally at odds with Matt's stated goal of treating and minimizing trauma to the troops. So I would say it has to be one or the other. Additionally, if we look at some of the broader systemic issues, we can see that mainstreaming has the potential to reinforce industrial civilization. So like I said, microdosing being used largely in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, the notion that using small amounts of LSD will make your programmers more competent. I would suggest that it's telling that LSD has begun to become accepted in society at the point where it no longer presents the threat of massive boundary dissolution and the potential for reorganizing society, but rather the reinforcement of wage labor and systems that keep us isolated and alienated from each other. And additionally, when folks like Aubrey Marcus make statements about how if we all just drank Wachuma and came down to the jungle together, we could possibly overcome our humanitarian challenges, you know, I would suggest that people who are in that unique situation of owning the means of production might turn the means of production over to their workers as a way of actually making material benefits in the world, rather than talking about how we can all come together in these fantastic situations. Additionally, if we look at a recent study, it's stated, done specifically on psychedelic medicine studies, it pointed out that 82.3% of participants were non-Hispanic white and concluded that minorities are greatly underrepresented in psychedelic medicine studies. It went on to point out that as a result, many of the findings may not generalize to marginalized communities. Additionally, we can see these issues at play in the characterization of indigenous and things that go on within shamanic and drug tourism contexts. And Rick's quote of, how do we reach out to police groups because they have more trauma, I would suggest the verb is a little misplaced. They cause more trauma. So, you know, I think as with cannabis, as with normal making statements about it doesn't matter why Boehner is now in support of legal cannabis while tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of folks are still locked down for basic drug crimes, to me, it's putting the cart before the horse. It's focusing on the wrong populations. It's not looking at the actual effects of systemic violence. And so, when we take a look at what mainstreaming looks like, we can also see that there's a lot of utilization of power to reinforce misogyny and patriarchy. And the words that I'd like to share are not my own. They were published publicly, and I would ask that you all take about 30 seconds to read them to yourself. So with that being said, I have a couple questions for Maps. Where do you draw the line? Is it if Compass signs exclusivity contracts with suppliers? Is it if Compass plans to subvert the regulators? Is it if one donor threatens to pull $500,000? What about 2? What about 5? Is it if the business models inherently deny access to others? Is it if you must collaborate with fascists and misogynists? Is it if your work requires legitimizing without critiquing murderous and traumatizing institutions and systems such as the Department of Defense or the Department of Health and Human Services? And is it if you're in breach of the statement of open science? Thank you.
I would like to invite the panelists to sit on the I don't know the word. Stage. Yeah, who has the mic?
Mic up front, please. Who has the mics?
Oh, can you bring it here to me, please? You can just.
Wow. I just needed a second to recover myself. That was fantastic. Very intense. I hope you guys are all feeling it. Thank I want to thank all of you for coming up here and being a part of this. This is amazing. And everyone in the audience, I'm hoping you were taking notes and getting some questions down because we'd love to start a conversation here. So yeah, who would like to start? My goal is to have 3 questions be presented to all of us, and then we'll give the panelists a chance to sort of select which question they would like to delve into. That we have more of a discussion and less of this back and forth, so we have more of a dialogue going. So yeah, feel free to raise a hand and we'll come around.
Hi, I just want to make a small reminder that we're using the hashtag.
Via, if you move in front of the speaker.
Okay, sorry. We're using the hashtag PoliPsy, PoliPsy, SY18 to Facebook and Twitter. And I also, since we're talking about capitalism, I just want to take a note to thank all the speakers that all of them came self-funded. We didn't give them any hotel or any transportation or any food at all, except some bagels and some coffee. So I do want to acknowledge the great efforts, especially for those who come out of town, to fund your entire trip. And there's different ways to put together a conference. One is to spend a few years fundraising and trying to do the same that Rick has done to other people, go to Rick and to others and ask for money. And the other way is to charge tickets. So we have, challenges in organizing conferences, and I appreciate very much the goodwill of the speakers, and I wanted to acknowledge that. Also wanted to acknowledge that those women out there, they're criticizing us for the lack of women. I'm saying, don't have illusions. They're all men there, but we are in charge, in fact, okay? Okay. Katie, who are you going to take questions from?
Yeah, who are we going to take questions from? I don't see a single hand up yet. Oh, I suppose I should have a mobile mic now, shouldn't I?
Okay, I'm taking it.
Thank you.
Can you come here?
Yeah.
For better. No, I'll hold it here. It's okay.
Over there?
Yeah, you hold that mic, okay? Yeah. Say your name. I'll hold it for you.
My name is Alicia Danforth, and I came prepared with a question. Back in 2011, I had an unnerving 1 degree of separation encounter with Peter Thiel related to my dissertation work. And when I saw it announced that he was on the board for Compass, I started doing a lot of homework. And it was very easy to find articles that demonized him, but I was looking for a balanced account. So I read an article. This article appeared in The Hill online, entitled "The Demonization of Peter Thiel" by Robert Goldberg in December of 2016. And my question for the panel, I'm truly trying to get a sense of what my community, in the broadest sense, believes. And Goldberg wrote, "The hysterical reaction to Peter Thiel reflects the belief that commercialization of medical science is a source of social injustice." And I'm trying to figure that out. And I wonder to what extent the panelists agree or disagree with that statement. Should I read just that part again? Goldberg writes, "The hysterical reaction to Peter Thiel reflects the belief that commercialization of medical science is a source of social injustice." Discuss.
3 questions.
Yes, please.
Can you come here, please, and say your name and just, Your name?
Sorry. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eugene Canatal, and my question is for Jeff. I was just wondering if you could expound upon what you were saying about yoga, meditation, leading to less empathy for folks. So that was just something that stuck with me from your talk, and I just was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. Thank you.
And another.
Oh, I didn't see.
Hands way in the back of the hat.
Here, come here.
Let's take 5. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Kellen Thomas. I had a question about, I appreciate the efforts to hire a patent attorney to figure out how to protect against the use of patents for psychedelic medicines. But one of my sort of greatest fears is the new legislation in 2007 about the risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, which is another regulatory mechanism that I think could be subverted. I was wondering if you could address how you thought we could prevent the subversion of that regulatory mechanism for trying to control the supply chain. Thanks.
I'm Joanna Steinhardt. I am curious about, this is for Rick, but also for all of you. If you met with Rebecca Mercer and talked to her, I'm curious what her motivation is, or what her stated motivation was in the donation. And then for all of you, if you've thought about this overlap, because the way I saw it was that her family is libertarian, and libertarians generally support drug legalization as well as being rabid capitalists. But so that there might be an overlap there in the legalization of some of these substances as well, even though that would go against the market logic of making a lot of money from their patenting. But anyway, because we can grow our own mushrooms, sort of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, we're just taking, opportunity to hear the public, make the best out of our time.
And if we have time, I do have some questions fielded from our online community. If I could pose that, I'd like to as well.
Cool, thanks. My name's Dave McGahee. I'm curious if the panel feels that the for-profit that's coming is inevitability, and if it's not, why? And if it is, what is the best version you would want to see?
And the final comments coming from our online community of psychedelic enthusiasts and advocates would be in regards to biopiracy. Can you hear me this way? God, it's so awful, I apologize. So talking about biopiracy, and then also talking about how the medicalization of psychedelics actually ends the war on drugs, or helps to contribute to the war on drugs, and maybe instead actually sustains it.
We're going to take the answers in the same order, if you don't mind. So Bob, Rick, Jeff, and Dave, okay?
Want somebody to repeat the questions?
Well, no. You just comment whatever you feel, you want to comment.
I'd like to comment on this. Good?
Maybe you do
Not
the
quite.
handheld mic. It was a lot louder. Yeah.
It's easier, thank you. Oh, yeah. Ooh, that's a lot louder. I would like to comment on the question of the role of, quote, for-profit, and start by saying that I'm not sure that for-profit versus non-profit is actually the most helpful distinction to focus on. The reason, as I alluded to earlier, is that every physician, psychotherapist, lawyer for that matter, in private practice, and we can call it a professional practice with professional standards, reports their income over expenses in a way that the IRS defines it as profit. Schedule C is a report of profit and loss from business. So profit's not intrinsically a bad thing. In this particular world, we seem to need money to survive. If you live in India, maybe you can live without money. It doesn't get very cold there. Places where it gets cold, we need shelter. If there's a group practice where a number of caregivers share a front office and a back office, there's now a group profit, which is probably a good thing. The decision makers are local. They're answerable to the community they're in. They have contact with the people they serve. So profit is not necessarily a bad thing. If I try to imagine what would be the benefit of delivering psychedelic-assisted therapy in a scaled profit model, I have to stretch a little bit. But the fact of the matter is Starbucks serves a pretty consistently good cup of coffee pretty much anywhere in the world. So the brand is worth something. There is quality control. There's consistency in the product. There's profit. But consumers also have a lot of choice. What would a psychedelic therapy chain look like? Well, hopefully it wouldn't be at all exclusive. And let me give you an illustration of what I mean by that. Let's suppose you go to a cardiologist who says, sorry to tell you, you've got a little problem there. But don't worry, there's a fairly simple surgical intervention that's quite likely to correct it. And then the cardiologist goes on to say, but I also have to tell you there's apparently a newer, somewhat more effective, somewhat safer version of that procedure. But the doctor across town who developed it won't tell the rest of us how he does it. So I think you'll probably want to go to the other cardiologist. How sad would that be? Where doctors don't help each other, where they don't share their best tools and their discoveries and their brand new discoveries with the medical profession. An even worse outcome would be if your cardiologist doesn't know about the new procedure, or knows about it and just doesn't tell you because then you'll leave his or her practice. So we need to think of what a chain would look like that isn't subject to those kinds of shortcomings. I'm not quite sure what the economy of scale would be, but there might be one. Maybe you could buy really nice audio equipment in bulk. Maybe you could share designs for a session room. Maybe you have a combination of treatment modalities which you're willing to share with the rest of the profession, but you deliver that combination really well. Maybe you have beautiful locations, maybe extraordinary food. There are lots of ways to compete that don't involve impeding or shutting out or erecting barriers. So we may see the development of, we'll say, branded psychedelic therapy. And I'm not convinced it's a bad thing, as long as there's a lot of freedom for everyone else to play and to have free access to even the newly discovered tools and technologies.
All right, well, I'll try to answer all the questions very quickly, but I will say that I'm particularly curious about the dangers of meditation. So I'll start with Peter Thiel. I think that we need to look at the actions of Compass, not at the ethics of their investors. And I think the same is true. We have taken money from Rebecca Mercer. We've taken money from libertarians. We've taken money from Republicans. We've taken money from venture capitalists. Taken means received in donations. And so I really think that that's not a logical way to think about these things. We can demonize particular investors or donors, but we need to look at the actions of the companies. And as I don't think Peter Thiel is spending 1 second thinking about how Compass actually works. And I don't think they're trying to influence them. So I think that kind of argument to demonize the donors or investors doesn't really get us very far. I think this question about the REMS was really good, the risk evaluation and mitigation strategies. And so what these are mechanisms by the FDA to control risks. Certain drugs have certain specific risks that other drugs don't, and so they've now got regulatory authority to provide certain kind of controls over how these drugs are used medically. And where we are negotiating the REMS with the FDA, with the DEA, and we will again with the European Medicines Agency, the main two things that we're going to be requiring in harmony with these organizations is that unlike most drugs that are approved as medicines, where then any physician can prescribe them, either for what they're approved for or for off-label uses, we are going to require that only those people that have been trained by us in our method or trained by other companies that are using our method and training people in that will be able to prescribe and treat people with MDMA. So what the FDA is looking at is that the drug therapy combination was what was proven together. It's not that MDMA or psilocybin will be approved out of context in the way in which it's administered. So the people that administered it need to understand what that context is and be trained in it. So I feel quite comfortable that that's a good way, because we don't want to start rolling these things out and have people who are not well trained, who are taking risky situations and not having good outcomes. The other thing that we're going to require with the REMS is that it's only administered under supervision, that these are not take-home drugs. So that's the essence of the REMS, and I don't think it's a bad thing. I think these are ways to control the rollout of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy to try to make it so that the benefits outweigh the risks and there's not a backlash against it. I think this question about how we think about like the motivations of Rebecca Mercer. Rebecca Mercer she restricted her donation to us, and it's restricted only for veterans. So her concerns is veterans with PTSD. What I find very interesting is that the main people who have been trying to control what MAPS does is David Nichols, is people who are telling us, don't help Compass, don't do this, don't do that. Don't take the money from Rebecca Mercer, don't do this or that. Rebecca Mercer herself has only said it has to be for veterans. So I think that what's happening from what I understand, is the donation that she gave to us came out within several days of an op-ed that she wrote in the Wall Street Journal, where she tried to say that she felt that she was being unfairly attacked in the media, and that she was actually very progressive in all these different ways, and she was pro-immigrants and all this and stuff. And you read this, and it sounds great, and then they got this little part where she says, but I'm still pro-Trump. So you kind of wonder, how did these things all go together? But at the same time, I think her motivation was to be involved in helping veterans and also trying to show that she could be progressive in certain ways. And she was introduced to me by a left-wing founder of a human rights organization. So it wasn't through right-wing military circles, it was through a human rights activist. I think this question about biopiracy, biopiracy. Sometimes I am so grateful that MDMA came from a lab. It eliminates all sorts of stuff about, did we snatch it out of a cultural context? It's out of the modern Western scientific context, invented by Merck in 1912. And so I think we're fortunate in that regard, and that we can sort of develop our own models for it without people saying that we're culturally appropriating something from somebody else. I think the essence, though, to get back to this final thing, which Bob was talking about, is the for-profit, non-profit, or the patenting or non-patenting aspect of it. And so from that, what I will say is that that development is not only inevitable, but it is necessary. Because we, as limited nonprofits, MAPS, USONA, Hefter, Beckley, there are hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, 300 million people with depression, 100 million people with treatment-resistant depression. There's 8 million people in the US with treatment-resistant PTSD. I do not think that we have the capacity to deliver the healing to all the people that need it from within a nonprofit context. I do think that the for-profit context needs to be operating under an ethical set of standards, and we will try to develop those and share those with others, and we can evaluate how people act. But I don't think that we should see the development of for-profit companies as a problem. We should see it as a sign of our success, that we have eliminated, after 30 years or so of work, MAPS is now 32 years old, we've eliminated, along with Hefter, along with other groups, the political obstructions for this research, which can now take place. So now for-profit people can think, aha, it's about doing the science, it's about getting the approvals, it's about treating patients. They don't have to factor in all of these other uncertainties for political repression. So I welcome the entrance of for-profit people. I also welcome the fact that, as Bob showed in all those books, that there's so much of this that is already in the public domain that I am not scared, nor do I believe that USONA, Bill Linton is not the one that's criticizing Compass. The people that work for Bill Linton, Roland Griffiths is sympathetic with Bill Richards working for Compass. That I don't think that the USONA people feel that they are going to be unable to find a synthetic route to psilocybin, nor will they be unable to do their phase 3 research. So I think that this patenting part, we want, if somebody could figure out a new way to make MDMA effective in 1 dose instead of 3 doses, we should let them do it. Let them, if they can patent, if somebody can invent it, some kind of MDMA that's with, okay, if somebody can invent a better version of MDMA, let them patent it.
So maybe a place to start extending on that would be to Alicia's question about is it hysterical to think that profit motive in healthcare inherently leads to injustice? And I don't think it is at all. I think there are fundamental differences between a for-profit versus a universal system. So I also agree that the for-profit nonprofit is not the most helpful distinction, because the NFL was a nonprofit. So you can do all kinds of unethical things in a nonprofit structure. So it's more so for-profit, I think, versus things that are in the common domain or that are more universally available. But there are fundamental differences between those systems. So if you're in the United States and you're poor and you are concerned about you have cancer diagnosis and you're looking for the best cancer treatment, people who have much less severe forms of cancer can jump the line on you because they can pay more. versus in a universalist system, it's based on need. And so when people complain about having to wait in line in universal healthcare systems, I think it's usually like somebody with a bad knee and a lot of money to spend who doesn't like waiting behind the guy with cancer who doesn't have much money to spend. So that to me is an inherent injustice. And if I could just give a personal example there, my mom died 3 years ago at age 67. And I have to think that in part our healthcare system had something to do with that, partly because 2 years before her death, my parents had gone 3 years without health insurance, which isn't great for your health when you're in your mid-60s. And then she had it for 2 years, but had some health problems that developed during that time that ultimately killed her. So that to me is an injustice, and that's coming from the family where my father at least went to college, where we kind of had enough. Like the further you go down on the socioeconomic scale, and if you're a person of color, the more likely those things are to happen. So I do think there are inherent injustices there. I'm also one who was opposed to the Mercer donation. Paulo Freire had a word for those kind of donations. He called it false charity. That's where you, with one hand, benefit from systemic inequality, and from the other hand, get to monopolize the altruism by giving a little bit of it back. With strings attached, oftentimes. I'm not saying that was, but oftentimes that is the case. And then the last point I think was about the meditation research, which I don't mind saying a little bit more about that. But a few years ago, I've been kind of uncritical of meditation, viewed it as pretty neutral, pretty much beneficial to anyone. I was at a diversity conference for therapists in different fields, and went to a panel discussion on cultural issues and mindfulness meditation, which was a question I hadn't thought about much, so I attended it. In that panel, they talked about things that they had seen, like with mindfulness meditation being taught in public schools, for example, where it didn't sound a whole lot different than how a psychiatric medication might be used in a public school to silence somebody, to redirect their suffering inward and not act it out and express it. And so I think you can very much, the meditation is pretty much a neutral tool when you abstract it from its context in Buddhism or whatever system of meditation you're using. And so I think particularly when you get too behavioral with it and you're just trying to use it for instrumental purposes, for some behavior or some narrow focus, it has the potential to be used in oppressive ways. So telling that kid who's acting out based on some traumatic history they've had and not having enough attention in the school because it's understaffed and whatever all the systemic things are, now they're acting out here in school, to tell them to kind of put them in a timeout with meditation, I think can be oppressive. Rather than helping them find other ways to take action against these things that are negatively impacting them. Am I out of time? Yes. Okay. So anyways, those research studies were in a Western context, and so might be something to do with the nature of capitalism. I suspect that can make meditation not be beneficial in some cases.
So I think the medical question is dismissed in one simple case. There are people in this country dying because they can't afford insulin. And they've tried to get it crowdfunded, and they failed, and they died. And you can Google that, and it's just true. I take a lot of issue with Rick talking about what Bill Linton and USONA are and are not cool with. They're not here to talk about what they are and are not cool with. There's the issue that Compass has signed an exclusivity deal with Onyx, right? Like there are actual market restrictions that they're engaged in, and you're supporting that, and you're well aware of it, and you're not sharing that, right? Like you're pretending like that's not the case. Additionally, if you look into Tapestry Networks, which was started by George Goldsmith, right? They exist as a regulatory capture agency. They literally traffic in regulatory capture. Now, that means that they're set up to run the regulators. That's problematic. I assume nobody here knows of 7 Cups. 7 Cups is one of the wonderful partnerships that Compass has that they're using to train their therapists with bots to engage in active listening. as far as the Rebecca Mercer stuff, I think it was disingenuous that it was presented as $1 million donation. It's $250,000 over 4 years. That money could have easily been made up over, well, and if we compare that with the Pineapple Fund, right, there was explicit statement about how much money was being raised over what period of time. Given the expertise of some of the folks making these statements, it's hard to not see that as misleading. Calling accurate statements about things that Peter Thiel has said and expressed as his visions for society as demonization, like, that's literally killing us. Like, I have friends, I have family who are dying as a result of these policies, and for you to present that as demonization is patently untrue. The Wall Street Journal article was PR. Rebecca Mercer has been referred to as the most powerful woman in the Republican Party. Noam Chomsky has accurately labeled the Republican Party as presenting the greatest threat to humanity. You know, when certain people call these folks fascists, it's not a smear. It's literally, they are textbook fascists. They are merging industry and state. They are shutting down free press. They are engaged in activities that put us all at risk. When we find ourselves in the streets with folks who are tapping into histories of genocide, of like actual assault on our communities, it's not inappropriate to push them out of those spaces. And I would say so too with Compass. The biopiracy issue is coming up likely because I called out Chris Killam and Zoe Helene and Cosmic Sister for engaging in what I would consider to be neo-colonialist and paternalist treatments of indigenous folks. Chris Killam is literally on the record saying Pure World's patent of maca is okay because they're granting the indigenous the rights to use their traditional plants, as though they have that permit, you know, as though they should have that power in the first place. It's laughable. If you go on my Facebook and you look at the things that Chris posted in defense of that, like, seriously, just take a look. Bob, I do take a bit of an issue with the for-profit Starbucks model. If we look at what's going on the production end, it's pretty horrific. You kind of acknowledged it with the cell phones too. I hear you as far as, like, I blow glass. I blow glass so that I don't have to monetize my psychedelic commentaries. That's a choice that I've made, and my glass blowing is tied to extractive industry, right? I cannot blow glass in a non-industrial context, and it comes with certain costs. That said, I think just because we recognize on the individual level that there is something to be said for profit doesn't mean we can't push towards systems that move away from that. And just as a final word, just look into the MAPS B Corp, look into the partnerships with DOD, DHHS. Kevin Balktick is here, like we have major issues as far as sexual assault and misogyny stuff being covered up, and I think, like, I mean, Neil Goldsmith was on the MAPS integration list until like a week or two ago. Like, according to Kevin's statement, there was damning evidence that he had engaged in fundamentally inappropriate behavior. So why the hell is MAPS sending people who are looking for help integrating to him? Thank you.
All right, guys, how about 2 more questions, if that inspired you at all. We're going to take 2 more questions from the audience. 2 more questions from the audience. Am I yelling in this thing yet? No more questions from the audience, really? Oh, there's one.
Here, you can come here, please. You want to make a question? Huh?
Okay, you can come here too, after her. Just a brief question, your name. No.
Oh. I'm Kat Konauer. A question for you, Rick, but starting first with thank you for your strategic vision and dedication lifelong that has brought us, along with a lot of other people, to this day, tons and tons. And I'm also wondering why you think MAPS is best poised to be the organization to deliver us into this next phase by having exclusive rights on who gets trained and then who delivers, particularly based on some of these things coming to light. But not just that, also statistics on the fact that those being sorry, I'm going too long, huh? Sorry. Yeah, I'll stop. No, it's good.
We're all under a lot of emotions, and
you know. I'm done. I think there's enough there. Okay. Thanks, Bia.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name is Jiro. Hi, Jiro, and yeah, and I really appreciate all people come and be together, and I like the temperature. And I see a special arm movement reached out. I see personal different energy by facial expression, but probably this high temperature cooking is, if we do now, I think it's beneficial for all of us. Thank you.
Last chance. Last question here, a comment, and then we're going to have everybody, in the same order. They can have a final comment about the questions or what the other panelists said. So just hold on tight. Last person that want to come up, in our infamous panel about capitalism in its very few last moments.
Thank you. This question has to do with the difference between microdosing and taking doses where you are not sure you ever even existed or were born, and the relative advantages to that. And it touches on there was a man who used to have a lot to do with psychedelics, and he talked about becoming a person of knowledge. And the key of that was being able to go between the worlds, so that you could face an angel in one room and turn around and face the devil in the next room, and it was all the same. And you could hold them both with love, because that's what the world was created of. So I'm interested in your perspectives on that, given our pressure cooker. Thank you.
Just for you to know, it's 3:30, so officially we're done. But we're gonna have, a little extra 5 minutes, and then it's the break. So please be concise, starting with Bob. You don't have? No, you can say it. It's a few words, just a final comment.
Okay, I'll do the final comment. Thank you for the question, but I wanted to save a minute for something else. Lest anyone walk away with an incorrect notion, I don't actually like the Starbucks model for the delivery of profound psychedelic experience. It came up because somebody up here, Rick, asked me, could I possibly envision a non-unethical, for-profit model for psychedelic therapy delivery? So I took the challenge. I think you can probably do it, but you need to put in a lot of checks and balances. Do I like it? Around capitalism in particular, and please understand capitalism is different from for-profit. Capitalism needs to be profitable, but there can be profit outside of a capitalist structure. Beware the nature of the beast. Are you familiar with this story where a person encounters a snake and it looks like maybe they can be friends, but the person's afraid of getting bitten, and the snake says, "Oh, don't worry, we'll just be friends. I wouldn't bite you." They become friends. The snake bites the person and says, "What's up with that? Ouch, I'm going to die." Well, you knew I was a snake. Okay, I think we need to be very careful of what capitalists and capital-driven structures will do to stay alive. They have a lot of tools at their disposal. Regulatory capture was mentioned. It's not just patents. There's the whole world of commercial contracts, of being first movers, of having very keen marketing departments that will build your brand. There's a whole wonderful, awful toolkit available. And I have to believe, as a starting assumption, that if there is a venture capital-backed entity coming into the psychedelic space, that they will use all of those available tools unless they promise not to. And so far, guess what? None of the two venture-backed organizations that I'm aware of have agreed to promise not to. So make of that what you will. If the snake bites, you knew what it was.
Well, let me start out with the angel and the devil in different rooms and holding them all with love. I think we need to think about that in terms of Peter Thiel and Rebecca Mercer, that these are dialogues that we're developing with people who have been demonized, rightly so, for certain things that they do, but I think we need to recognize that they're learning about psychedelic therapy. They're learning about spirituality to some extent. So it's not like these are fundamentally evil people. We should shun them completely. We have to look at, what strings are attached, if any, but I think that that idea of holding with love those who are on other sides of political divides is really important, and I think we need to build bridges. I don't think we should be burning bridges. I think we should be building bridges. As far as this question about the REMS and MAPS being the only organization that can train these therapists, the reason is a regulatory reason. The reason is that we have developed this method. We have not patented this method. We have put this method called inner-directed therapy up on the website. Anybody could read it. Anybody can see our therapeutic approach. But it's the therapeutic approach that's being used in the clinical studies, and the FDA wants people who will be able to prescribe this to know the therapeutic approach that we have developed. It's from Stan Groff. It's from Bill Richards. It talks about the inner healer, the inner healing intelligence. It's different than other therapeutic methods. And so we're being given the responsibility to make sure that once therapists are able to prescribe this and deliver it to people, that they have learned how it became approved and how it was proved safe and efficacious. However, they can modify the method any way they want to. That's what's called prescribing off-label. So we're not going to control once people are approved. So they'll be able to innovate. And also we are funding studies with some of the Veterans Administration trained therapists and some of the top PTSD researchers who have developed non-drug psychotherapies for PTSD, prolonged exposure, cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing therapy. And we're actually funding studies for them to blend MDMA with their own methods. Maybe they'll come up with a better method. We're doing it primarily to teach the experts in PTSD research the value of MDMA. And so we're fine if they come up with other methods. But we do have the obligation, both from the EMA and from the FDA, to train the therapists. And as I said, I don't think we'll be the only company doing that, certainly not after it goes generic. But I do want to be the only company until we're assured that somebody else can do it as good or better than we can.
Not sure to start there. Okay, so just one comment on microdosing, since that came up. So I wouldn't rule out any use of a psychedelic as potentially beneficial, and I'm interested in seeing research and all that. But I also think that's probably the use that is most easily incorporated into capitalism and the most non-threatening and non-revolutionary use. At the same time, I recognize people use all types of drugs for all kinds of reasons, and so if it helps somebody with their depression or whatever it is that they're using it for, who am I to say don't do that, or that's a wrong way to use it? So, but I'm more skeptical that use could have the transformative potential, or that's going to kind of lead to broader acceptance in the culture, because I think the experience is not comparable in any way to a full dose experience. And then just for my final comments, I would say if some of you are out there thinking that you're in agreement that the role of capitalism and for-profit in the psychedelic space is problematic, and you're not sure what to do about it, I would say stop trying to figure out what to do about it, and instead talk to other people about what to do about it. So I think our best solutions come from collective efforts. Just two things that have happened in the last year that I've been involved, three things really that have happened in the last year that I've been involved with, which were all this collective effort, was one, organizing a drug users union in Chicago. So people can advocate for themselves in the media and drug policy, wherever else, do harm reduction with each other. It was starting a harm reduction and integration group for people who use psychedelics, so that they can know how to mitigate the risks, and then also process either positive or negative experiences they've had. And then lastly, organizing around creating safe consumption spaces where people can use all drugs. So, but those are all things that I just, with a group of people, just started talking about that. And then sometimes when you start talking about things, you actually end up doing them. So I would say don't rack your brain about how to resist capitalism. Like I would suggest for MAPS, maybe that should be a standing item on your agenda at the meetings or something. It's like, how do we resist capitalism this week? But just to talk about it collectively.
So Bob keeps avoiding names. I'd just like to throw out there the company is Eleusis. In 2015, they filed a patent for LSD for Alzheimer's. Look it up. It's on Google. I think it's really interesting the number of clinicians and other folks that make comments about how political and social systems work, when if we came into a lab and made similar comments about how the lab works or proposed a clinical study, we'd probably get laughed out. And so like when we're talking about like fascists, it feels important to drive home the fact that, like, you know, Rick and I had a conversation at Entheogenesis Australis where he informed me that as a Jew, he didn't feel it was appropriate to punch people like Richard Spencer. I informed him that as a Jew, I felt the only way you engage with Richard Spencer is to punch him. Again, history is drenched with the blood of what happens when you let folks like this get power. When authoritarians get power, they use that power. We suffer for it. Additionally, I guess as final comments, literally everything that I raised on that question page is happening. I've got evidence for most of it. I've got indications for most of it. I'm looking to that will be coming out in the coming months. And like, seriously, y'all, like most of that, if you start digging through the compass, like who's who, look at Thomas Lundgren. The guy was the head of the EMA. He left. He started a consultancy company while he was still in the EMA. He left 2 months after that, and the watchdogs were like, oh, this looks a little off, but we're not quite sure. 7 months after that, 2 independent watchdog agencies were like, what the hell is this? Can we please get an investigation? It's all out there. It's not really well hidden. The amount of dirt that these people have been involved in is ridiculous. And the fact that there's defense of this, like, to my mind, this literally threatens the future of anybody who's interested in doing psychedelic research. The Isle of Man is not like part of the EU. It's a regulatory haven. It's a tax haven. It's right. Like the reason that folks are looking at doing this stuff in the US is because we set the policy for the world. We are the most like draconian prohibitionist country. If you can get legalization done here, theoretically you could get it done anywhere. So why the hell would we jeopardize that? Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, all of our presenters, for being here, for participating. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for being here. The last thing I will leave us with is that we are here because we all believe in this medicine, but we also are here because there's a massive global drug war. So please remember that at the base of all of this talk, that we're trying to end a war on drugs. And with that, we'll see you at 4 o'clock.
And group photo here. You're gonna make